It's time for On Point with Julian Phillips.
Well, welcome to On Point. And what a difference a few weeks make. We've seen a horrific death in Minneapolis, George Floyd, of course, at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department, their 4 officers. They have been charged due to sustained protests. The protests, as many of you, of course, know now, have metastasized worldwide. All 50 states, of course, like that. I guess the question is, what does protesting actually do? Well, actually, it has actually produced a lot outside of those arrests. We are now talking about police reform, even in Minneapolis, where the city council was talking about totally disbanding the police department. Now the police commissioner is saying now that he is halting contract negotiations with the police unions. Is also looking for reform. Now, of course, in Washington, the Democrats have come up with plans of their own. We saw a picture there of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Jim Clyburn and the rest of the Democrats kneeling with kente cloth on. I thought that was a little bit overstaged a little bit. But nonetheless, they've come up with some reform. What will the Republicans do? What will the Trump administration do? So today's On Point, we're going to be focusing on the protests, but more importantly, what's going on in Washington and police reform, and what kind of changes, systemic changes, we can see across the board. I want to bring in 2 distinguished guests. One you already know, Eric Ham. Of course, he's a political analyst and a best-selling author. He's been on our show before. And another distinguished guest, James Lawrence. Commissioner Lawrence was the commissioner of Nassau County in New York, Long Island, one of the largest counties in the United States, and also the chief of personnel for NYPD. Very important that people know. We're talking about just getting exposure. Chief Lawrence at the time was one of the heroes of 9/11. During the course of those buildings being hit by the planes, he was in charge of police headquarters. Many people don't know that, so he truly is a hero. So, Commissioner, welcome to On Point.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
I want to talk, Eric, I want to start with you first. We want to talk about the protests in part, but what the protests have produced. And we're looking at reform now that's being produced by lawmakers, the Democrats, the Republicans perhaps are soon to follow. Bring us up to speed on what the lawmakers are proposing.
Sure. Let's start with what's taking place in Washington. There was legislation that was introduced this week by House Democrats, and this is actually pretty sweeping legislation, which some might think doesn't go as far as what we've been hearing from actually what's taking place on the ground, where you've got this slogan, defund the police. But the legislation that we're seeing on the House would actually ban chokeholds. And then something else that's equally important is it would eliminate what's called qualified immunity, and that would take away this immunity that police officers typically maintain in the event of a police shooting or something where it involves the death of a civilian. And what it does is it creates greater accountability for police officers. And this is actually, I think, goes at the heart of what we are seeing taking place right now with just a number of police shootings or officer-involved killings of unarmed African-American men. This legislation is now in the House Judiciary Committee. In fact, there is a hearing that took place this morning that included the brother of George Floyd. So we expect that legislation to go through House Judiciary Committee and then to the full House. Now, in addition to that, what we're seeing is now the Senate, led by Republicans, are also looking at legislation as well. Now, this legislation does not involve the ban or use of a chokehold or eliminating qualified immunity. But one area where it does align with the House-led legislation by Democrats is it does call for withholding federal funds if, in fact, police departments withhold information regarding officer-involved shootings. But it's still a major win that we do see Senate Republicans actually attempting to bring something to the table. And this legislation is actually being spearheaded by Republican Senator from South Carolina, Tim Scott. We also know that President Donald Trump is expecting to address police officers sometime this week, where he too will lay out his parameters for police reform. So the protests that we have been seeing for the last 2 weeks now are not only galvanizing the nation and the world, but given the polarization that we're seeing in Washington, remember, Republicans control the White House and the Senate, Democrats control the House. And it's typically very difficult, given this climate, given that we are in an election year, that you will see such wholesale changes. But the fact that we're seeing lawmakers from both sides of the aisle talking about some type of change bodes well for what we could see in terms of reforms.
Right. Of course, we got to understand now anything that the Democrats propose could be vetoed in total by the Republicans, specifically President Trump. Commissioner, I want to talk to you about reform. And one thing, humans get their minds wrapped around a word or a phrase. And the big thing now is defund. I was talking to somebody earlier that said, well, defunding, we can't defund the police. Can you explain, from what you know and your experience, what defunding actually means and how that might change the nature and scope of policing in this country?
Well, first, you have to look at the total world of policing, right? You have departments like NYPD, 40,000 cops. And you might have, small town, that has about 10 cops. It means different things to both of those departments. In New York, the police are responsible for a myriad of things. And what I believe when they talk about it as far as New York is concerned, is taking some of those responsibilities, such as dealing with the homeless, dealing with the mentally ill, and taking funds from the police department to support efforts in addressing those conditions.
Right. So one thing we're talking about here, we are not talking about getting rid of police. We're not necessarily talking about reducing the ranks of police officers on the street. Is that the case? Is that what you understand it to be, even though the police departments?
Well, possibly you might reduce the ranks, because naturally, if you take funds away, you might have to reduce your force.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you'll be taking some of those responsibilities that the force has been carrying out and giving them to another agency, possibly.
Okay, so here's the thing. If this means a change in a positive direction, everybody, as far as I'm concerned, should be on board with this because it will reduce the amount of crime. Let's look at the city of Camden, New Jersey. Camden, New Jersey had one of the highest crime rates in the country. Maybe in the top 5, they were rated maybe number 3, number 2 maybe. The question, they changed and they defunded, they restructured the police department, took it into the hands of the county, and from what we understand now, according to their statistics, crime is down 40%. Now, even with crime being down there are still some people that are complaining there are not enough people of color in the police department. Still, we have seen some change for the better there. So defunding is not necessarily a bad thing.
Well, I think it still depends on the department you're talking about.
Okay.
And I've heard different people come with different takes on what happened in Camden. I heard someone said that was a really bad department. In other words, they felt that they couldn't reform that department. That's how bad it was. And they used a lot of personnel from that department to create the new department. So they didn't bring in all new people, but they brought in people that were familiar with the circumstances in the area. Now, I don't think you could do something like that with a department the size of NYPD or Nassau County. It's just too many people. And you want to have continued service. You don't want to break in service, right?
The one thing, though, that I think all of us could probably agree on, Commissioner, and even Eric as well, I want you to chime in on this. The Minneapolis City Council, as you know, has proposed dismantling their police department. If you dismantle a police department, what do you have left? Are we talking about anarchy? Are we talking about a different system of public safety? What would that be? Eric, could you chime in on that?
Well, I think what we're seeing here now is, particularly in light of so many killings of unarmed men of color, particularly African-American men, And given that there is so many resources going to policing, like we talk about policing, but also we have to recognize that now we are also policing our children in schools, where now you see children in schools as young as 6, 7, 8 years old, not being sent to a counselor, not being sent to detention, but being handcuffed and sent to a police department. That is not what we see the role of police is. And I think what you're seeing from a number of these protests and demonstrations across the country is a call for pulling back on in terms of this law enforcement or this police regiment in terms of how policing is done and how policing is handled. And I think that's what the commissioner is saying, that basically this cannot, and I don't think this is a one size fits all. For example, what took place in Camden, New Jersey, you're right. You know, we cannot see something like that happen with the NYPD or even the LAPD or the DC Police Department where I am. But what we do recognize is that each police department is different, but more importantly, the resources that go into these departments, it needs to be looked at in terms of wholesale changes, because what we see is society is needing more and more, and we're putting more and more on police officers who frankly are not social workers, police officers who frankly are not child psychiatrists or child psychologists, police officers who frankly are not equipped to deal with mentally ill people. And so what we're saying is basically these billions upon billions of dollars that we're putting into the police department to address these issues, let's adequately fund the sources and the resources in the areas and the agencies that adequately need that, and have the people that can meet the needs of those particular communities.
Okay, Eric, that's a good point. And Commissioner, you said something earlier before the show. We were talking briefly that it goes down to the state and local municipalities. They say politics is local. Well, of course, policing is local as well. So one glove does not fit all. In terms of larger police departments, and you have worked in both at the highest of levels. What would you suggest if you were still there, say, for instance, in New York City or Nassau County, that might work best? What would be the first thing that you would consider doing in terms of reforming how the police operate in communities in those areas?
Well, see, I think we've already been there. Community policing. We started community policing under Mayor Dinkins, and it worked well. Crime was going down, and the reason I say community policing is because I think that cops should sit down with the people that they serve and talk about how their neighborhood should be policed. In other words, I shouldn't, as a law enforcement officer, I shouldn't make a decision about how to police that community. Naturally, I have certain expertise as far as certain crimes are concerned. But when you talk about the total operation in the neighborhood, the community should play a part. And when you sit down and talk and make decisions with the people you serve, that bodes well, especially when you come to a time of crisis, right? Because you're not just introducing yourself in the case of an emergency or in the case of an incident like we had in Minneapolis. What really troubled me about that incident in Minneapolis is those cops operated like it was business as usual. I didn't see a supervisor. I didn't really see many people gather. It was just despicable.
Listen, community policing is a great thing. And of course, things have to be tailored to the communities that are involved here. But there's also an 800-pound gorilla in the room here. And Commissioner, you know that all too well. And those are the unions.
Yes.
They're very powerful. And they don't act as an advocate necessarily for the people. Yeah. They are an advocate and defense attorneys for their police officers at hand. And a lot of people are worried about that. What do we do? How can we get around, or even the police unions, to come on board and say, hey, look, it's not just a one-all fixed thing. All the police are not right. We got to weed out our bad people. What do we do about the police unions?
You know, they have to be a partner. And you know my experiences in Nassau County. You know, we butted heads. So, you know, I tried to work with them, but many times you just can't work with a union, and especially if they have politicians that are going to back up everything that they do. Right? So, you know, politics plays an important role in how strong a union really is. Right? Right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
How
absolutely.
strong it really is. And, you know, I wouldn't say that all union members, you know, think a certain way, but, you know, unions tend to protect their members. And who do they tend to protect the most? The ones that have, you know, allegedly committed an offense, right?
Yeah.
So their focus is always on the cops that we feel are problematic.
And therein lies a major problem, because there's always going to be a divide between the police and the communities that they serve. If you have these unions that are behind cops, even if they visibly see a chokehold like on somebody in the streets of Staten Island, like Eric Garner, and you have somebody like Pat Lynch out there who's protecting his men. You mentioned something, Commissioner, very important too.
But it's more than Pat Lynch, though. You
Well,
know, chokeholds have been a violation of department regulations in New York City since 1993. So, you know, that's not the issue. The chokehold was illegal.
Right. And yet,
Garner was what, in 2014?
Right.
2014, 93. So cops were trained. They knew the chokeholds were illegal.
All right, we've got about only 2 minutes left for this show. Of course, we know in New York City, it took 5 years in order for Daniel Pantaleo even to be fired. No charges were brought against those cops, and thus protests abound everywhere. It's just a multitude of things. Eric, I want to get back to you in terms of politics. The commissioner mentioned that, and it's very key. We have an election coming up right now. We have Republicans that are apparently, you know, teetering on the fence. Some are possibly coming around. Lisa Murkowski coming around, Mitt Romney. How important is it to you in your mind that the protests continue to put pressure on politicians to ensure that they make the kind of changes that we need in this country when it comes to police reform?
Well, Julian, we're already seeing that with much of the approval numbers that are coming out in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. Right now, you've got an overwhelming majority of Americans that believe that police play a role in racially profiling African Americans, particularly African American men. And now you're seeing a number of white Americans that are sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement. And also, here's what's important to note. When you look at where the change has moved in terms of the sympathy that white America now has for Black Lives Matter versus the sympathy people had for gay marriage, it has moved much faster in a much more visceral way towards sympathy towards Black Lives Matter than what we saw even with gay marriage. And so now that is actually moving the needle very much so as we head into an all-important November election. And Republicans in particular are seeing that. Remember, right now, they're holding the Senate by a thread. And that's why you see them now acquiescing and looking to do something, attempting to do something at least on police reform, because it's not just an urban problem anymore. You have people in suburban and rural areas now protesting and demonstrating in places in Iowa, Utah, places where we just didn't think that we would see people holding up signs saying Black Lives Matter. They're now doing that in lockstep with many Americans across the country. And that has politicians, particularly on the right, taking notice, even though they are, like most Democrats too, are very closely aligned with police unions.
Right. That's going to have to be the last word. There's so much more we could talk about here, but I think we really got into it on this program. Eric Ham, of course, always thank you. Commissioner Lawrence, thank you for your insight as well. I want to just say one thing for our viewers before we go. There's an old saying that The journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. I think here there's two words that come to mind: cautious optimism. I think we've taken the first step in this country. And I think that because of the pressure that has been put on by all sorts of people, people of various races and genders that have come together for a common cause of righteousness and equality, that the powers that be, the politicians, the lawmakers, even police forces, are going to have to change. The question is, what will that change be? We can't be afraid of the word defunding. As Commissioner Lawrence says, it means different things for different communities. The bottom line is we can't stay the same way that we have been. They say insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results. It's not going to happen that way. We're going to have to change by agreeing to change and by compromise. I believe that we're on the right start, but we will only stay that way when we put and continue to keep sustained pressure on. Keeping the pressure on politicians is one thing, just for change in policing, but we also have to change in other areas: voter registration, anti-lynching laws, voter suppression, and we're seeing that now, some irregularities in the state of Georgia. Keeping that pressure on, but for a good reason, for good things, for positive things, and for staying on point. I'm glad you could be with me today for this important show for On Point. We'll see you again next week.